A nome del Dipartimento di Scienze delle Antichità, anche io do oggi in questa seduta il benvenuto a tutti coloro che partecipano in maniera attiva o anche soltanto come uditori a questo interessante convegno e in particolare appunto questa organizzazione comune tra il CNR e la Sapienza di Roma, non certamente il primo caso di queste felici collaborazioni, ma certamente uno dei più significativi.
What I'm going to try to do is a general overview of one of the most renowned sites in the Levante and in the whole Near East, or in the world, as the Palestinians always repeat. And our perspective is to try to see how many times this site has been has witnessed the attempts of a community to resist to catastrophes. It's a very long history, and we will try to disentangle all these evidence through the means of modern archaeology. It's a tremendous task, but I think that is very interesting because it can help us to have an idea of what a terrible enterprise is human life. So we start with this picture showing how Jericho was in the 30s, when only the second expedition came to the site, and there was a previous Austro-German expedition at the beginning of the 20th century. You see the location of the site, a very important geographical spot in the southern Jordan Valley with a flourishing oasis, which was irrigated by a very conspicuous spring, the spring of Ain Sultan. You see the presumable extension of the site in antiquity, with the spring being included within the tell. You see that the spring, which was a huge elliptical fountain built during the 19th century, has been roofed by the Norwegian-Italian cooperation with this red roof. Water was the basic resource of the site, and in some ways it caused that Tell Sultan was occupied over more than 10 millennia, and it was the reason of the resilience of the site to catastrophes, but was also, as we will see, at the basis of some important crises involving the life of the site. Jericho is not only a pleasant place with an oasis well irrigated by the spring, but is also in a very difficult location from the point of view of tectonic, of seismic activity, connected with the African plaques that we have seen yesterday. This means that the site is at a very dangerous fault from the point of view of earthquakes. And now we will start our journey down in very deep and dark history. We start from the pre-Neolithic period. That means at least 10,000 years before present. The most renowned monument of this period was excavated by Garden Canyon. It's this huge stone tower. The purposes of this tower are not so clear. It seems a defensive installation of a very fastly, in relative terms, of course, growing community who invented agriculture and animal husbandry. This was a major step of the Neolithic period, as you see. And the fact that life at Jericho was not easy, it was full of catastrophes, demonstrated by the numerous repairs of this tower. And you know that Kathleen Kenyon was a very careful archaeologist, and she counted more than 11, 12 archaeological stages of reconstruction and repairs of this monument. We now focus on one very famous event, which is attested to in the tower. Quite puzzling finding inside the staircase, which allows to go on the top of the tower, and there was found a group of human skeletons, which was in secondary disposal. And already Kenyon started a debate trying to giving an historical interpretation of this find. There was not such a number of communities fighting each other. It was easier to move to another natural resource instead of attacking a very well protected village or small town as Jericho already was. So this interpretation in some ways has been criticized, and different hypotheses were put forward. For example, an internal riot, like what happens now in the Middle East, and fighting inside the community for the control of the power. All these, of course, cannot be demonstrated without other possible indication. The next stage of Jericho is the pre-Pottery Neolithic PPNB, which is characterized by the invention of modular architecture and by the diffusion of this funerary custom, that is the separation of the skulls from the bodies, and in some cases the skulls were modeled with plasters. And you see here in this stage some famous evidence of terrible earthquakes, like cracks and collapsed walls made of bricks. There should be a relationship between the invention of bricks and the frequency of earthquakes, because the modular architecture has a higher level of resilience to earthquake strikes, and in many cases they could also reuse, if they survived, the bricks, as they always did. Our expedition had the opportunity to access the archives of John Garson's expedition, the first British expedition at Tel Sultan, which was superseded by Catherine Kenyon expedition and remained due to the Second World War largely unpublished. We studied the documentation, as you see these pictures, of this excavation, and very interesting finds came out. You see here the location of a very important, a very striking find, that is two pits with statues made of clay. Actually, the only thing famous and today on exhibit in the Rockefeller Museum is this head that you see on the left. But the head, as we discovered by the picture that you see, belonged actually to a statue like the famous one found in the contemporary site of Ain Ghazal, nearby Amman. And furthermore, these statues were not one, but there were at least 3 statues in one pit and at least 2 in another. So there should be a group of statues also in Tel Sultan from a layer which is dated to the very end of the pre-Pottery Neolithic B, and they were buried in the vicinity of a small shrine. This tradition, which precedes the invention of pottery of some centuries. The use of clay for modeling small statues or representation of ancestors is also tested in the well-known Trench 1, as these examples show. In the same area of the shrine with the statues, a big crack was found, which is very well dated at the end of pre-pottery. And then a new phase which Kenyon defined of cultural regressions was instead marked by the invention of pottery. That means that the community which arrived in Jericho had a flint industry which is not comparable to the previous one, had houses of a level much lower than as defining and building technique of the previous period, but they brought pottery, and this marks a different, an important difference for archaeologists. But also the pottery Neolithic ends with not only a terrible earthquake struck, but also with an occupational hiatus, which is marked by a silty layer full of small pebbles, which has been interpreted in two different ways by archaeologists. One is a kind of flood or wadi, from the wadi which descends down from the Mount of Temptation. The other interpretation is that there was a shift of the spring, and this, in my opinion, is the most suitable hypothesis. Due to an earthquake, the spring shifted, and perhaps for some period was not easier to be catched by the community, so that in the following period, the Chalcolithic period, Tel Sultan was not occupied. There is an interruption on the life of the site. And in the last decades, the Palestinians have identified the major site in the oasis during the Chalcolithic period, which is Khirbet el-Mafjar, which is now under excavation by the Palestinian-Norwegian expedition. And in Jericho there are some finds dating to this period, the famous Chalcolithic period, which marks a very easy to be distinguished by archaeologists difference in material culture, but is an ephemeral occupation of small fragmentation. And I put this slide of the sycamore in Jericho of Zacchaeus to give a proof of the resilience in the Holy Land of some, especially trees, also the olive trees of the sacred compound in the Mount of Olives. They can resist for millennia. And now we move to a very different historical phase, that is the Bronze Age. This is characterized by the arrival of a new community of farmers. They settled with circular huts, and they prefer curvilinear. This transformation has been followed by archaeologists through at least three main archaeological periods, from early Bronze 1A, early Bronze 1B, and then the arrival of urbanization in early Bronze 2. Actually, it's a continuous growing of the same site. Nonetheless, during this continuous transformation, there are some stops, there are some catastrophes, which marks changes. And these catastrophes perhaps helped the community to take decisions which affected the development of the site. For example, after the earthquakes, terrace walls like this, major terrace walls were built and rebuilt, and the problem of organizing the urban layout, we say urban in brackets, the layout of this village, which was becoming a town, became a problem, and they started to enucleate different sectors. I want to stress that these dramatic events always stimulated a further transformation of the site towards the final layout of a city. For the happiness of our colleagues, Felix, we have fortunately radiocarbon datings for this period from a silos containing seeds. The problem is you see here, always from canyon excavation, and this has been recalibrated many times, and they give when I say a good dating, I'm saying a dating which is consistent with the traditionally used periodization in the Levant, and this makes me very Felix, very happy. And you see how was archaeology in the 30s, how romantic there was archaeology in the middle of dust, and of course without any consideration of stratigraphy. So each beam that you see in these pictures actually belonged to a layer which was already excavated. But this is when you understand this system, you are able to give each thing to the right strata, since these were British excavations, something very serious. And we devoted a book to this period, the early Bronze II, which is the earliest phase in which Jericho becomes a city. Since we are in Palestine, we must use, this was the book, we must use the only one indicator that archaeologists were able to distinguish, which are the city walls. The famous 70 meters long canyon trench one on the eastern and the northern side. You can see here clearly the superimposition of the different city wall, especially the earliest one, the early Bronze IIa city wall, which is a very characteristic dune yellow bricks. This city was fortified in early bronze to be with the addition of horse-shaped towers, and inside the city a special area was distinguished, which is the so-called Spring Hill, the area immediately overlooking the spring where public buildings were located. Which were the main issues supporting the development of urbanization. The control on metal trade along the Jordan Valley, the Egyptian contacts or the influence, which is poorly demonstrated by this Egyptian iron palette, and in the following, especially in the following early Bronze III, the connection with the Levant. But actually, this is a reconstruction of Jericho in the early Bronze II, which I take a picture, which I take about the aircraft. And this wonderful city was destroyed by another terrible earthquake, the evidence of which is shown everywhere on the site. That means that the buildings made of these very clear dunish yellow bricks are always found collapsed, and even the city walls, and there are cracks or fire affecting also the domestic buildings. Actually, the end of the end of AB2 in many sites of central Palestine is characterized by these earthquakes. So it should be perhaps a phenomenon connected, even though this cannot be demonstrated because the area of an earthquake usually, which gives some dramatic effects, is in not so wide as the whole region. Otherwise would have been a tremendous catastrophe. Then this event, the earthquake causing the end of early Bronze II Jericho, the earliest city, happened around 2700 BC. There are some calibrated datings from canyon excavations, and you see that there is a calibrated date and there was a measured date, because since calibration is under the hands of experts, which put many not objective statistical methods, I always prefer to keep the two, and I will show you that the archaeological periodization give a date which in some ways is consistent, or it is not. I don't know if this is a real catastrophe, if there is not a correspondence between the two, because in the early Bronze Age we have problems, but I don't know if there are real problems. This pictures again gives the idea of what kind of heap of ruins is Tel Sultan. It's very difficult to disentangle each different archaeological phase, and we are now in the city of the early Bronze III, the most flourishing period of the third millennium, and we are always coping with fortification. Now you can have an idea why Jericho is famous for fortification, because fortifications are the only massive work which has survived 2 millennia, and they were very huge structures. In 2008, we re-excavated a corner of the city in which, in the inner wall, which was a wall 4 meters wide, there was already the original plaster was already preserved. And I want to focus your attention on this whitish layer in between the inner and the outer wall. The EB3 city was in fact defended by a double line of fortification. In between this double line of fortification, there were blind rooms, and when John Garsang, for the first time, identified one of these blind rooms with this white layer inside, filling completely one of these rooms, he was sure that he had found Joshua, because he thought that this was white ashes from the biblical destruction of Jericho, described in the first book of Joshua, and in the book of Joshua, chapter 6. So, Kenyon took this interpretation, and only in the last decades we were able to demonstrate that this is not ashes. This is Hawara, is the whitish limestone, sand limestone, which was used as a filling, and the misunderstanding was due to the presence of carbonized beams which were collapsed from the ceilings or the balconies of the city wall. And here you see the city gate, the inner city gate, completely filled up with collapsed bricks. Also, the early Bronze Age city suffered several earthquakes, and some of them left on the ground very impressive evidence, such as these bricks collapsed in area B. This was one of the main points of archaeologists excavating Jericho in search of Joshua. Garsang explicitly announced that he was going back to this site to demonstrate, to find out the biblical event. So after some days, since this evidence still emerges on the edges of the tell, he discovered such an impressive destruction, and the immediate connection with the biblical account was done, and it took several years to change the mind of scholars. In the last years, our expedition has excavated a palace, or what we can call a public building, a building which is an oversized in respect of houses. And I'm sure that in comparison with Egypt, nothing in Palestine can be taken as something. And you see here this building, which is exactly underneath the Mount of Temptation and facing the spring. Also this palace, which has a long life, from the early Bronze II up to the early Bronze III, for at least 4 centuries, and many refurbishing. But inside it there are, of course, it witnesses a series of violent fires, and the problem is if this fire may be connected to an enemy attack, this means to a human intervention, either it is the effect of a terrible earthquake, because pottery and even ceilings show the same orientation in the collapse, but not only in the same building but also in different areas of the site. The exact connection between earthquakes and fires is difficult to be demonstrated, even though we are aware that the lightning was done with oil and very easy to burn stuff. Of course, Jericho is full of this evidence, and after the destruction of the early Bronze Age city, there is another kind of hiatus and a regression to a non-urban organization of the society, in which the site was occupied by a rural village, and this is a famous period in the history of Palestine, an intermediate Palestine Bronze Age, as it was called by Kenyon, but it's quite amazing that during this period the technology of bronze was introduced in Palestine. No more copper, but the first example of the tin and copper link. And now we move to the most famous and monumental city of Jericho, that is the one of the 2nd millennium BC, in some ways in connection with the Egyptian 13th dynasty, or the period in which the Egyptians felt them to be ruled by foreign rulers. The Italian Palestinian expedition explored again the fortification system of this period. Here you see a massive tower, which was part of the defense system of the Middle Bronze one. This tower has a very extraordinary state of preservation, up to 2.4 meters of height, and it had been refurbished, as you should see here, with the addition of walls and also with some walls around the foundation. Also, this is an addition after an earthquake during his life. So this was a monument with a quite complicated history. It was founded over big blocks or orthostates foundation, and you see here the evidence from the destruction at the end of Middle Bronze one with Tel Yaudille fragment, and a possible responsible of this destruction. Of course, we have no direct proof. But Jericho, the oasis that you see in the foreground, was a place which attracted the Egyptians traveling through the Levant, because it had an environment which is very similar to the Nilotic one. So I think that there should be more than a relationship between the Jericho and Egypt. Another evidence for destruction is inside the 2nd line of fortification of the Middle Bronze Age, and we are now at the massive defense system of the most flourishing period in the history of Palestine, which is called the Middle Bronze 3 or 2C in the terminology of the of Albright School in the United States. This final period is characterized by a further enhancement of defenses of the site, with the building up of this supporting wall all around the site, which was the foreign relationship of this site. We have to use very small and poor and weak evidence, such as scarabs, but since this pharaoh is almost very unknown, or very few attestation, there are about him. I'm speaking about Otepibra, Neriote Otepibra. He perhaps was one of these Asiatic or in good connection with Asiatic rulers already in the 13th dynasty. And you see the fantastic finds from the royal tombs in Tel Mardich Ebla, and 3 possible sites which should be connected during this period. Also this city, inside the city was excavated by Garstang, suffered another terrible destruction. At around 1550, we were not yet able to find the Thera sand of pumice in the strata of this city, but what we found is a very terrible destruction. And now I will show you, I would like to show you how it looked Jericho at that time. This is the palace of the king, this is the spring, and there was a very complicated defensive system with ramparts supporting a mud big wall. The palace was looking towards the oasis, and aside the palace, on the other side of the city, there was the city temple. The city temple has been identified last year. It had been completely removed by Byzantine pits, but the huge foundation of this building are preserved, and it belongs to a very famous typology of buildings that are these tower temples with 2. This is the end of Jericho, under the weapons of an unknown enemy, and the troops of I don't know who. Thanks. And this is perhaps one of the possible actors of this tragedy. And since we are with Egyptologists, I have to give this hint at a connection. You see here a series of tombs which were discovered underneath the Middle Bronze Age palace. Some of them were discovered by Catherine Kenyon, and one by the Italian expedition. Why they are interesting? Because Jericho has a huge necropolis in the same period, which is outside the site in the northern plateau. These are tombs built up underneath the palace, and they have given items which point to a connection. For example, you see here a bronze belt, which has a very striking connection with a find from Teledaba, obviously. One of these tombs was a tomb of a lady, and in this tomb was found a scarab, and under the suggestion of my colleague Pina, here a title is readable, a title of an Egyptian title, Ajmer, was identified. Actually, this title is basically a 3rd millennium title, but perhaps it was preserved in Jericho. And the reading of the other hieroglyphics perhaps gives the possible name of of the site in the Canaanite language. This suggestion, which I published in the festival, Professor Steger, should allow us to identify Ruka in Egyptian sources, but I have not the time to do this. I would like that the Egyptologists look for me this name in the sources, because they know much better than me which kind of tomb may have this mention of this site. So thank you for your attention, and you see that Jericho always has a new known and the symbol of resilience, rebirth, is always present. Thank you.